probably.
So, we're getting into a little bit different stuff that is going to look at the underlying forces of labor and prices and interest rates. So these are as I mentioned last week, we spent all of our time learning how to measure variables, right? So we measured GDP, we measured unemployment, and we measured inflation, right? So we spent time learning how to measure those things. And now we're going to start learning some of the underlying forces, economic forces that are at work to change those things. Like, why does unemployment go up and down? Why does the price level go up and down? Why does the GDP go up and down? What are the underlying forces at play for that? And we're going to do that by looking at markets, because we have a market-based system. And our two primary markets are the output market and the resource market, right? Our two primary places at work. So the next two chapters this week is focused on the labor market and the capital market. So we're going to be hanging out down here for a while, thinking about the forces at play in the labor market, which is really chapter 23, and then the forces at play in the capital market, which is 24. So that's kind of where we're going this week with things. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick overview of the market model that we're going to try to build over really the rest of the course, but especially the next 4 weeks. So I call it kind of the four-market model of the economy. Four-market model. Macro model, if we want to make sure we're talking macroeconomics here, not micro. And so I just want you at this point to put 4 graphs on your paper. I'm not even going to fill in a lot of the details here, but just put graphs kind of stacked like that. And so in a market, when you hear that word, we should be thinking kind of supply and demand going on in different places. And so the first two, this week what we're hitting on is the labor market first, where there's going to be a labor demand and a labor supply. People who want to work and businesses who want to buy workers, right? Or at least rent them for 8 hours a day with the wage and pay. So we're going to start thinking about that market system and that exchange, and from that is going to come out a wage that we pay, and we're going to get the quantity of workers working, which is going to be labor. So we've got a quantity of people working at an average level of wage. So this will touch on unemployment and kind of think about the underlying forces that cause the supply of labor. This is where the golf club comes into play. Those of you who've been wondering why I'm carrying around a golf club. So what causes the supply to increase and potentially wages to drop? What causes the demand for labor to go up and possibly increase the wages that are being paid, right? So we're going to look at supply and demand forces in the labor market for this upcoming chapter. That's what we'll spend most of our time today on. All right, so then we're going to move into the capital market, where we've got interest rates. And at this point, we can keep this really kind of simple. We've got a supply curve of loanable funds, put SLF. I'm not going to define anything because I'm jumping the gun, but I just want you to have a kind of a picture of where we're taking this so that you see why we're talking about something. So this will be this week too. And here we're going to be measuring the amount of loanable funds. How much money is out there for businesses to borrow for a new building, a new machine, a new computer, right? And so the interaction of people who are supplying money, loanable funds, and people who want to, businesses that want to borrow funds, is going to come out with some sort of interest rate being negotiated for loans. So we're going to have a certain amount of money being borrowed and lended at some sort of interest rate. And then we'll look at the forces at play that cause more people to save money, maybe more people to borrow money. What are the forces at play? All right. Then we're going to drop down to the money market. And this is not money market mutual fund, but I call it the money market, the supply of money. So we're going to get into money. Let me get my prop out. We're going to get into this, right? What's the supply curve of this and the demand curve for this? For reasons we'll learn later, the money supply curve is vertical, and the money demand curve is downward sloping like these other demand curves. And depending on what the interest rate is, people will want to hold more or less money, and the interaction of the government who prints off this stuff and people who want to hold this stuff in their wallet is going to have a certain amount of money in the system being circulated. So let's just put a couple dollar signs down there. We'll get into a lot more details later. This is next week's material. We'll spend a whole week just on that chapter alone. That'll be you might be kind of happy to hear that that's a one chapter week. It's a big chapter, but we're going to spend the whole week next week on this alone. All right, and then finally, we're going to measure those final goods and services by looking at real GDP and the price level. Those two things that we just got done last week measuring, the consumer price index or whatever index we're using to measure prices, the average level of prices, and then this is going to be the demand for all goods and services, aggregate demand. And then we're going to have the short run aggregate supply curve. And then if you want to just draw it right straight through the intersection here, we're going to have a long run aggregate supply curve. So we've got two supply curves on this deal. One's more longer term looking and one's shorter term looking. And from that, we're going to have a certain amount of real GDP, that's $16 trillion, and the average level of prices, whatever that is. I guess I forgot to put my equilibrium interest rate over here. So we're going to use these four markets, a chapter at a time basically, to try to get this big picture view of various economic forces that drive these variables that should be important to us and hopefully important to Trump and hopefully important to other people in Congress that are thinking about what does the picture look like. What are some goals for those three variables? Three goals. So number one, real GDP. Do we want that going up or down? What's the good direction that we would want? Up or down for real GDP? Up. What's the real part again? What triggers in your brain when you hear the word real, hopefully? Actual, good, that'd be one. Actual what? Actual what? So GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries over the course of a year. What is real about real GDP? What is it honing in on? What's it estimating? Melanie said actual. I just want to add on to that. Actual what?
Inflation prices.
Inflation prices. It did something with that. What did it do? What's the real part of real? What are we focusing in on? Quantity. Excellent. That's worth an extra credit point. Cameron, nice. Quantity is what we're honing in on. So, real GDP is equal to the sum of the goods in the economy, the P's and the Q's of I equals 1 to N. That's kind of the shorthand notation. The value of chicken wings, the value of beer, the value of lawyer services, the value of dental services, right? It's the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of this last year. So what makes it real, so that was GDP, if we just look at that. We've got this price effect and the quantity effect. What we really care about is the quantity effect. The actual quantities is what I was trying to nudge Melanie into giving me here. The actual quantities, right? So we did that whole process of separating out the price effect and the quantity effect. The price effect gives us our measures of inflation. The quantity effect is real economic growth, and that's the one we're hoping to have going up. So for real GDP, we take a base year price, you know, maybe it's the prices in 2012 times the quantities in 2017. Real GDP of 17. So we fixed the prices, and now we have a measure of quantities. How many more chicken wings did I eat? How many more beers did I drink? How many more lawyers' services did I use? Which again, that one might go contrary, one of our drawbacks of using GDP as a measure of social welfare, but we had some other ones like that too. All right, so the key here is the goal is that we want this increasing. So this is one of Trump's big claims. Obama over the last 3 years was not able to get up to 3%. He was stayed in about the 2% growth rates. What does Trump say he wants to get to as a goal? He's not even claiming he can for sure do it, but although the way he talks, he makes it sound like it's a done deal, but trust me, it's not. But what's he trying to get to? Anybody know? Remember that from the campaign trail? So economic growth. Obama's been in the 2 to close to 3, but he never really got there. So economic growth was really weak for a variety of reasons. We had the financial crisis. I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm just stating a fact. 2 to 3%. Trump wants to be at 4 to 5. I've heard him say at different times. 4 to 5. So he wants to see real GDP increasing at a rate of more like 4% compared to what it was before. Now, why is that important? How much is GDP in general? What's our number we've been throwing around? $16 trillion. $16 trillion. Let's see, how much is that? That's $1 billion. So there was 1 million, there's 1 billion, there's our trillion. What is 1% of this number? What is 1%? So 16, what is 1%? How would we do that? What's 10%? How would we figure 10%? Let's see, if I take 100 and I take 10% of 100, what do I do? It's 10, right? So what did I do here? I multiply by 0.1, but that really just shifts the decimal place over 1, right? So if 10% would be this, right? What's 1%? One more over. So 1% of 100 is one more over, $1, right? $100, 1% is $1. So we go over here, and that's our number. What is that number? $160 billion. So having this ambition to bump up to 4 from, let's say it was 3, brings in 160, right? Because I'm kind of sliding this over down a couple places. So $160 billion. Does that sound like some help for the economy? Yeah. 1% growth is a lot of money. 1% is a lot of money for our big economy. If we take 160 billion, how many people do we have in this population again? Roughly 300 million. So if we have 160, what is it again? Billion. So 160 billion. This is kind of easier if I write it all out. 160 billion. Let's see, is that enough? Nope. Billion divided by 300 million, right? That's the population. So we got population. This is our new income. This is income growth, by the way. This is like new money on a given year. We can cheat kind of and do that. 160,000 divided by 300. What'd you get, Ashley? I saw you had the calculator handy. 1,600 divided by 3 is the number I want. So I think you might have missed a couple zeros if you did the whole enchilada. 1,600 divided by 533. Okay, so what is this number? 533 what?
Non-mileage person.
Yes. On average, of course. This isn't going to happen for real, but it just helps put things into perspective, right? Every American, little 2-week-old babies, 107-year-old old folks. Population of the United States. New money, new economic activity, 1% gives us this amount of income. On average, that would mean $533 in everybody's pocket. Now we know that 533 is not going into everybody's pocket, the little 2-week-old baby and the old folks, right? But is $533 a decent amount of money for you guys? If I said, hey, you're gonna, yeah, right? This is some serious stuff. Economic activity, growth in the economy, growth of real GDP is important stuff. These are good ways to help alleviate poverty. A lot of problems go away when people can work and people can change jobs too. The person who's working at McDonald's that got laid off from their graphic design job, remember talking about that person? If they have an opportunity to get back into graphic design because that industry is now starting to take off a little bit more. People are starting to spend money on advertising. We need more graphic designers. It's a big deal. All right, so back to this picture for a second. I got to come back to there. Well, wait, maybe I should finish off this thought here. I did get kind of excited on it. This is the first time I've ever done this for a class. This whole idea of the 1% growth, I think I heard it on a radio show of what 1% meant, and I'm like, well, shoot, I got to do that in class. How much money is that? And honestly, I never took it to this level until we just did it just now. So this is $533 per person on average. 1% growth. So this is with 1% growth. With 1% more growth, I should say, than where we were before. All right, so one of our objectives by our policymakers across party lines, which is true, in general, we want to see increasing real GDP, economic growth, for these types of reasons. It can help things out. All right, questions or comments on that? All right, number 2 of our 3 goals. Unemployment. What about unemployment? What's our goal? 0? 0%? No. Hopefully you saw that on your tests and your homework. Not 0%, because a healthy economy has a certain amount of unemployment to it, right? What types of unemployment were those? Structural and frictional. So those 2 types made up what economists call the natural rate of unemployment. We'd expect a healthy economy to have a certain amount of unemployment. And so for this goal, I just want kind of low unemployment for the goal. At the natural rate. The natural rate of unemployment. Which most economists, we wrote it in the notes last time, so I don't want to put it up again. What did I give you guys? 4.5% up to 5.5%, 6%. I mean, somewhere in that range is what most economists would agree is where the economy should be at if it's healthy. Okay, so low unemployment, and then number 3 brings us to the prices. And we'd like to see low and stable inflation. Low, stable inflation. When we get to this money chapter, we'll talk about some economies that have 50% inflation per month. 50%. So something costs you $1 January, what are we again, 23rd today? January 23rd, 1 month later, that can of Coke or whatever is $1.50. 2 months later, it's gone up another 50%. That's not good. People can't make kind of good decisions on how to behave with their money and how to plan and think for the future and maybe make business deals or engage in trade. That causes a lot of problems. And so we'd like to see inflation low, but more than just low, we don't want it kind of going up and down, up and down, up and down. We'd like to see stable inflation too. And so our current target for the Fed is 2%. And probably in general, economists would agree if we stayed somewhere between 2 and 3, that's a good target. At different times in our history, we've been kind of in between here. Right now, they're kind of targeting 2%. So we just kind of got, okay, that dollar item 1 year later cost $1.02. Right? So it's fairly low, stable, fairly insignificant for us as consumers anyway, in the grand scheme of things. All right, so any questions or comments there? 3 goals of the economy. There's more goals that could be out there, but these are the ones I've kind of plucked out from the chapters we just went through. We learned how to measure all 3 of these things, right? And this is what we're hoping our policymakers are keeping in mind. So from this picture here, the labor market, this is chapter 23, right? 22 was the last one we just did, 21, 22. Chapter 24. Chapter 25. And then the goods market, I have to double check because I was trying to think if there's something in between there. I think there is. Yeah, because then we get into the exchange rates for a little bit. And we skip to chapter 27. Chapter 27. So this is just an overview for you to kind of reference back to when we start looking at each one. So today our focus is going to be on the labor market for the most part. Okay. Keep that up for a second. So, economic growth can be thought of as the percentage change in real GDP. If we're measuring growth rates like we did already. How did we show economic growth with the production possibilities frontier? Or maybe we have, well, let's just go back to even some beer and pizza, maybe. So we got two goods. The production possibility frontier shows the maximum combination of two goods an economy can produce, given its, what's the last part of that? Resources and labor is part of in the resource base, but yes, labor. Time, we're kind of looking at a freezing time. So time is true, but that's what we're looking at, the production possibilities at a moment in time, like a smaller kind of holding time constant. So we got resources and not labor costs, because we're actually not dealing with dollars even here, because we've got, I could make some pizza, I could make some beer, I could be at point A, I could be at point B, I could be at point C, I could be anywhere along the production possibilities frontier, given my available resources and technology. Good. So the technology is the other part. Technology is really the information of how we put those things together. It's kind of like entrepreneurship, I think, in terms of our levels. So we've got a quantity of labor, a quantity of land, a quantity of machines, right? We got quantities figured out, quantity of resources, but then technology. What do we know about putting these things together? Production process, profit maximization, you name it. Technology is kind of just a word for information that helps us transform resources into other things. So it's a big category of information. What makes it technology is that it's information that helps us produce other stuff. Is really what technology is. So it's kind of a specialized form of information. Other sorts of information would be, what was the rainfall last month in Kansas? Right? That's information, but it's not really a part of technology. Right? So technology is certainly not information on what the Kardashians are doing currently. That's information. Right? Technology is information that's used in the production process or used in the marketplace. Okay, so how was economic growth shown here? This is chapter 2 stuff. How was economic growth shown? Let's start off graphically. What happened to this frontier when there was economic growth? It shifted outward, right? And so there was different ways that it could shift outward. It could shift to maybe something like this, which was kind of cool. We came up with a new technology that helped out with pizza production. And so it doesn't get us any more beer if we're looking at this point, because it was a technology that was specific to pizza. Like there was this new way of combining a few different resources, and that allowed us to go from this amount of pizza to this amount of pizza. But what's awesome is that it allowed me to have more beer. Now that's counterintuitive at first. I could be at point D now. How does a pizza technology get me more beer? Trade, yes. Add on to that, trade in what? I mean, we can kind of pin this down a couple of different ways.
The resources it takes.
Okay, good. The trade-off between the resources that it takes. So without that, with the old technology, I had to have, I don't know, let's just say 10 workers. With the new technology, maybe it only takes me 8 because I'm more efficient at making pizza now, right? Those 2 people might be unemployed short term, but hopefully after they get their layoff notice, a couple weeks later, there's openings at the beer place, right? So they get re-employed. So there's this shift of resources into other uses. And sometimes that creates owie moments. Crap, I just lost my job. But from the economy's perspective, when we have technology hit us like that, it causes this reallocation of resources to higher and better uses. Some machines become obsolete. Some people's skills become obsolete. Those are the owie moments, that transition. It gets hurt. Some businesses might lose some money during that process, and they have to change, and sometimes change hurts, right? At a personal level and at a business level. And sometimes at an economy level, national level, change hurts. But the result of that pizza technology potentially got us to a point like D, where we've got more beer and more stuff. Pretty awesome. Okay, so that's economic growth with the production possibilities frontier. It's possible that it could shift out even, right? So we had some other examples where maybe next year it does this as we find more resources, and hopefully our path, we get out to point E. And so we continue to have more and more quantity. The thing I want to emphasize, tying it back to today, is that this is the quantity of pizza, right? This is the quantity of beer. We have more stuff. We have more real GDP is the connection back from this kind of more micro concept of beer and pizza, then scales up to all goods and services. We got the same thing going on. So economic growth here is kind of B to D to E, you can think about. So that is economic growth, is B to D to E, or more generally, a shift out of the production possibilities frontier. That's an important concept to kind of hang with us the rest of the term for macro. So this is a good model that we'll reference back to. All right, so the other picture we did was the business cycle. And so the business cycle measured real GDP, which, remember, will start to really become, I try to use this more early on when we're starting off this material, but the Y is income, real GDP. You can use those two things interchangeably. And over time, we see real GDP having its ups and downs. So that was the business cycle that we got introduced to. And so another way to think about economic growth over time is to look at this picture and hopefully see a trend. An upward trend is the same thing as this percentage change in GDP being positive, whether it's 3% or 4%. Over time, that would be an upward appearance to the data. Sometimes it goes down, recession. Sometimes it goes up, so it's volatile in that respect. But if we think about the longer-term picture, we get this idea of economic growth. So positive trend is economic growth in the business cycle. Over longer periods of time. All right, so we're going to call this our potential level of GDP. So what is our potential? So potential GDP is kind of the edge of the frontier. I'll put that as a side comment after, but the potential GDP, and this is really the real GDP, our potential real GDP is what we believe GDP can be using all available resources and technology. And so this red line I just drew is kind of a straight line. It could have a little bit of movement on it, but you can think about this red line as being the potential real GDP. Which means what we observe in the real world, the actual level is sometimes higher than potential, which seems a little weird at first, right? This is actual GDP, and currently we're higher than what our potential is. Well, that means we must have screwed up potential or something, right? But not necessarily. We can get into points where we're having workers work a lot of overtime, right? So we're maybe using our resources beyond sustainability. Maybe from an environmental standpoint, there could be a bump up in GDP, but it's due to maybe some harm to something going on with the quantity of fish. We're overfishing the oceans, or we're doing something to deplete the resource base in an unsustainable way. Right, so it's possible for us to be above what would be optimal or potential for long-run sustainability. And then, of course, the recessions bring up the actual being less at certain points in time than potential. All right. So what causes this to fluctuate? There's some interesting data around the world on real GDP per person. And it's been a bit of a puzzle for economists to try to figure out. All right, so international data on real GDP per person. Real GDP per person, which is called per capita real GDP. How much income per person? So I'm going to use YPC, per capita income, is equal to real GDP divided by the population. Similar to what we did in that exercise of, well, what does 1% growth get us? The $533 more per person. Pretty awesome. All right, so I've got some data here from 2009, and we've got the good old US of A. US of A in 2009 was $46,000 per person. And so this is, there's different data that's out there, but it's 2009, this is from the International Monetary Fund. I'll just leave it like that, 2009. So then we've got Hong Kong and Singapore. Hong Kong and Singapore. They are also at about this 46,000 level. Right now, they're actually even a little bit above the United States. Japan, that we spent some time on in the first week, 32,000 per person. So all of these are per capita GDPs. France, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy, some of our European friends over there, $32,000. Central Europe, So these are kind of the former Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries. Kind of came out of communist type regimes, Ukraine, some of those. $18,000 per person. Central and South America. Central and South America. Our friends to the south, somewhere between, most of them are between $8,000 to $11,000. Average country income per person, $8,000 to $11,000. And now we've got, lastly here, Africa, $2,000 per person. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is an important one. Mainland China is in this 8 to 11. Central and South America and China. Mainland China. They're currently in that 8 to 11,000 range. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is, why the disparity? What has gone on in these countries that causes our income to be so less? I mean, some of the American elites would maybe like to think, well, they're just stupid down there. Can we really attribute it to that? Probably not. These are big differences, right? Especially if you get down to 2,000. But even it's kind of puzzling, haven't these countries been around a little bit longer than the good old United States? Oh, this is America again? What's our birthday coming up every 4th of July? Roughly, let's see, 17, what was that year, was that again? 1776, 1876, 1976, 230 some years old. That's how old America is. Now, some of you guys have had history and some world geography and stuff. How old is Germany and the United Kingdom? Freaking old. How many people have been over to UK? Didn't we have a Brit in here now that I think about it? Is that this class? Or was it my other class? That was personal finance, yeah. We had, and I've got one of my econ majors is from there too. You know, you can go visit some castles that are, you know, one was made in, I don't know, 1300, 1100. What year is it again? 2000? That's just a castle that was there, right? So why, these guys have been around so much longer, how did we do so well? In terms of income anyway. Right? These are big differences. Is there a difference in purchasing power between the two? Yeah, I mean, you can kind of, it's okay to kind of think about this as, I have a $46,000 a year job, I've got a $32,000 a year job. I got an $18,000 a year job, I've got an $11,000 a year job. These numbers have been adjusted for something called purchasing power parity. That was actually in your, they at least mentioned it in your textbook, PPP. So purchasing power has been adjusted for with these numbers. So it's okay to think about it that way in terms of income. Well, this has been kind of a puzzling thing. You know, where does the globe go over time? Do these numbers tend to converge or diverge from each other? Is an interesting puzzle piece. Here's some extra info. In 1960, these three were here. In 1960. These three countries were down here. So another level of detail to our puzzle. 1960, each and every individual down here on average was making this 8 to 11,000. So in about 40 years, less than 40 even, about 40 years, they jumped up to being real close. For a while there, they were just under, and now, as I said, they're even some that are a little bit over the United States. So in 40 years, we've seen that, but yet Africa's down here. And other parts of Central and South America are down here. Now, from a geography standpoint, Central America is a lot closer to the United States than Hong Kong. Does anybody know much about Hong Kong? It's a little itty bitty tiny island that basically has no natural resources. Literally. They don't have coal, they don't have oil, they don't have jack. They really don't have anything, but yet over the last 40 years, they've been able to have their citizens on average march right up to the United States level of income per person. So these are some of the puzzling things that we'll start to think about as we work through this chapter. All right, let me talk about mainland China for a little bit, since that's kind of a hot button. Anybody know what the population of China is?
1 billion.
Yeah, over 1 billion, like 1.2 actually. And so what's the United States again? 300 million. So a person standpoint, they are 4 times larger than us in terms of their labor force. So note, China is 4 times larger than the US in terms of population. Now, Hong Kong is that little tiny island I was just talking about, used to be a part of China. Still kind of is related. What happened to little old Hong Kong over time? They went away from the Chinese. Does anybody know the story? Some of you do. What happened to Hong Kong? Who took them over? One of the people up here, one of these countries kind of decided they liked Hong Kong too. They thought it was pretty cool that it was this little island right on the ocean.
Didn't it used to be a British colony?
British colony. So we go way back to old history. The Brits started taking over the world, right? The Brits went all over. They went to India. They went to China. They went all over. They were going to colonize and make the world one British colony, right? So they made extensions. That's part of some old history. And then in 1953 or 52, can't remember, I might even be wrong on that, sometime in the early 50s, Hong Kong was given back to China by the Brits under some very specific conditions. The specific conditions were they would not be under Chinese communism. So remember, the Brits completely owned Hong Kong. Like, they owned it, and they're like, all right, well, we'll be willing to make Hong Kong its own kind of sovereign nation under these conditions. It doesn't go back to communist China, and it continues to be a port, and we're going to establish a rule of law or help that process. So really, the Hong Kong citizens helped develop the government there, and so they are operating their own market-based economy, because like I said, they have really no natural resources other than their labor, and they, after that, in the early 50s, this was where they were in the 1960, and now they're here. All from kind of letting the country go at its own pace with the rule of law and not going under communist China. Communist China, they're right still here. They've been growing, but they're still down here a ways. So that's an interesting part of the puzzle. What did Hong Kong do differently than mainland China? They started off at the same place. Hong Kong and mainland China were both down here. Hong Kong zipped up. All right, so interesting. So another side note here, China is 200 times the size of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's just a little tiny itty bitty. So if you're wondering if I'm trying to tee up the ultimate takeover of the world by China, I am to some degree. So be ready for that. Not to scare you, I think China's got a long ways to go, but China has been starting to embrace more free market capitalism to some degree. They've started to, the communist leaders have started to let markets play out a little bit more. And so that's why we started to see China and Chinese growth a little bit more. And so the question is, how quickly could they come up here? And how much of a force, or do we care? President Obama, I think, did a pretty good job of trying to keep friendly relations. Trump, on the other hand, seems to come out throwing sticks. Well, he does that for everybody, so I guess it's kind of maybe expected, but we'll see what our relationships with China ends up being after the Trump regime. Not sure where that's all going to go. I'm still hoping that Trump is just being strategic in how he'll set up relationships, and that it'll be a win-win situation for both countries. Okay, so our first topic I want to hit on is growth rates. Like, how long would it take a country to go? How many of you have done the rule of 70 or the rule of 72? Have you heard that for growth rates? The rule of 70, the rule of 72. The textbook here uses the rule of 70. Technically, I think it's 72, but it's really some rounding errors anyway, so I think a lot of people have changed it to the rule of 70. So let's look at what the rule of 70 is. It's really a neat thing to kind of memorize the rest of your life. You'd be surprised how this comes in handy. So the rule of 70 is the number of times it takes something to double in size. So the number of years it takes a variable, let's call it a variable x, to double in size. I'm writing it like this because the number of years it takes a variable to double in size is equal to 70 divided by the growth rate. And this would be the annual growth rate. So that's why they call it the rule of 70. It turns out to just be kind of a weird mathematical thing that it's a pretty complex equation to actually solve out. But this is just a rule of thumb type of thing. It turns out you take 70, 42, divide it by the annual growth rate, and you're going to pretty much estimate the number of years it takes something to double. Okay, so let's do some examples. Example number 1. If YPC, per capita income for China, is equal to $8,000, and the per capita income for the United States is equal to $46,000. With economic growth of 10% and 2% for each country respectively, when will China catch up to the US in terms of per capita income? Probably not my best English here, but I could have done it a little differently. But so we've got China assumed to be down here at 8,000, the United States at 46,000, China growing at 10%, the US growing at 2%. When will China catch up? I'll walk around the room. You've got the 70, you've got the growth rate. So you can start to think of, well, when is China going to double from 8,000 to 16,000? Kind of your first step in this process is to think, how long is it going to take China to go from 8,000 to 16,000? Anybody got the answer to that off the top of your head? 7 years. 70 divided by 7 is how that works, right? 70 divided by 7. So let's I'll just leave that first step to you here. So number of years to double equal to 70 divided by 7 equals 7 years for China to double from 8 to 16. But they ain't there yet. There's more to this problem. So go ahead and start working on that. Just raise your hand. I'll give you a little nudge if you need one. Yeah, you can pull out your phone, put it on airplane mode for me. Where did I get 7? That's a good question. 70 divided by what? 10. I just did a typo. Sorry about that. 70 divided by 10. 10 is the growth rate. 70 divided by 10 is 7. So interpretation would be in 7 years, China grows from 8 to 16,000. In 7 years, China's going to grow from 8 to 16. I will also tell you, especially for this exercise, you don't have to get it perfect, but just kind of give me in the right ballpark for this. This is actually a pretty tough problem. But I want you to kind of see a couple things going on. Okay, that's good. Yeah. And okay, that's good. So this is how long it takes the United States to develop, right? So within 35 years, I think it was they grew what's in 7. Started off at 8. So 16. So 8. What's that? Exactly. So that's what I'm going to do. Not quite. Because you need to think about this one. So we have, now what is the wrong numbers? 70. 70 is always the best. So that's so then you're kind of on the right track. But then these guys are double up more times. Okay, good. You're on the right track. Now think about the United States. Try to show your work a little bit more. But yeah, it looks like you have the right idea there. Because the United States. What's that?
70.
Okay, 35. Yes. All right. So yeah, what you get to? Okay, but that means there's. So now estimate how long they'll actually. That's where you can just kind of eyeball it. It gets a little tough. Anybody else need a nudge over here? Okay.
Yeah.
So China's doubling. So what I'm going to show everybody here is that we went from, in 7 years, China, I should say they went from 8 to what in 7 years? 16,000. What did the United States do? How long, what's their progress? So the USA here, using the rule of 70 divided by, 35 years. So now they have an opportunity within that 35 years to double from 16 to 32. So now start thinking about their progress over time and how long it's taking them in the United States. You know, you got it? In there? Okay, 35 years, right? Okay, so now start showing some numbers. It's going to go from 8,000 to 16 in 7 years. And then in another 7, like, so see how they're growing. The United States is at 46,000. And how long does it take them to double? 35 to 92. And now, how many more times do these guys start to catch up? Yeah. It's a little mind-boggling at first. Anybody else need a nudge? Looks like you guys are on the right track. Okay, that's good. Yep. And then think about the United States. You gotta take out 20. Is that what you got? Okay. Jacob has to take off to his other class. He's an overlapper this term. So he says 22, a little over 22-ish. All right, everybody else got a good start. Anybody need a nudge? You got something down? Huh? Oh, you just came in? Oh, okay. Well, you just spit that. All right. We'll kind of review it here in a bit. What about you? What? You? Okay, well, let me help. Okay, so. All right. You got the number of years, right? Yeah. So 7 years for the I started at 8. In 7 years, we're going to have 7 more years, we're going to have 32. There's half of the United States is doing the same thing, except when are they doubling? One thing I don't see have what's their doubling time? So same thing going on for the United States. Yeah. And that's over 35 years. Then here they're close, but they're not quite there. And that's where you start to get into the estimating the other time. Okay, good. Yeah. So now they cross paths somewhere in between here, right?
Yeah.
So we'd have to do some averages, but you're on the right track. You're far enough. I wanted to get people to that step. Okay, you're doubling. Okay. It looked like most of you that I eyeballed or everybody that raised their hands got the nudge going here. So let's get us all to the same point. So for China, China has 8,000 that turns into 16,000 after 7 years because of the doubling, then to 32, then to 64, then to 128. So this is in 7 plus 7 plus 7. That's the way this whole rule of 70 works. So we got 14. This is a 28-year time frame, right? All right. Then we've got the United States, who is at 46,000, and it takes them 35 years, which kind of comes into my thing over here, to get to, if this is the time frames, we're over here to 90 what? $92,000, right? So 35 years. So when do they cross is kind of the question. Somewhere in between here, something goes on, right? And so where's the United States at that time frame? Okay, so let me pause there for a second. I'm never going to ask you this difficult a one on a test or a homework, I don't think. Okay? So this is as tough as this gets. It almost gets beyond it because this is all just kind of estimates on the average growth. How you could solve it, other answers besides Jacob's at 22. Did anybody else get that type of range? And you got right after 22. What did you do to get there? Because I'm guessing that sounds about right.
So I think 92,000 minus 46,000.
Okay, so you got basically $46,000 of growth over 5 years.
And then divided it by 45
Yeah.
years, so you get growth per year.
Yeah, that gives it per year, right?
And then I kept that number, I'm using it by how many years I wanted to
Right.
match up. Sorry.
Okay, so I'm not even gonna, I don't want to worry you guys about this. I won't do this to you on a test. I will give you a problem like this potentially, but the numbers will work out a little bit easier so that you're not doing this type of estimation. So you are probably right, because I had at least 3 hands go up for around 22 years. We're taking that growth of 46, dividing it evenly over the 35-year period to kind of see where they might be, and then we can do the same up here, right? Because we have $64,000 worth of growth over the 7-year period. So over this 7-year period, we got 64 divided by 7, whatever that turns out to be, and then we get math geeked out, right? We can sit there and calculate it, and we have math geeks in the world. I'm not sure that these are, although I suspect there's some math inclined people. Jacob, is he actually majoring there, or minor or something? Yeah, so he's been doing this type of stuff. So I don't expect you guys to be there. I think we don't need everybody in the world to be able to solve a problem like that, point blank. So, but I want you to see the thought process of the rule of 70, because it's kind of cool. So if the United States inflation rate is 3%, if the United States inflation rate is 3%, how long will it take my McDonald's cheeseburger for $1 to double in price to $2? Roughly. If the United States inflation rate is 3%, how long is it going to take that cheeseburger to double price from a $1 menu to a $2 menu? Just over 23 years. So it's 70 divided by 3. So that's why, once you get the hang of it, it's kind of cool. 70 divided by 3 is approximately 23 years. And so then, again, it's just a rule of thumb. So that you can think every 20 years in the United States, roughly, prices double. And it's kind of fun for me being older. You guys were, most of you, not born yet, I think. But if you go 20, especially 23 years ago, I don't know if I've got everybody pegged down here, but for a guy like me who's 40, what am I now? 45, I think. I can think back to what something cost when I was 25, and it's freaking true, right? I mean, the price is about double. I think about a can of Coke. It was always 50 cents at most at every, play. Now, of course, it's $1 or $1.25 for that same can of Coke, right? So you see those prices. It really does work that way on the doubling, and so that's kind of handy. You can use this on tree growth. How long is your little tree going to take to grow if your tree is growing at 15%, how long will it take to double from 2 feet? So if tree growth is 15%, when does my 6-foot tree turn into 12-foot tree? I'm giving you kind of hard numbers, but
4.5 years.
4.5 years. So 70 divided by 15. We just go right back to that rule of thumb. 70 divided by 15. It's a little over 4 years. So my 6-foot tree is going to become a 12-foot tree in a little over 4 years. So it's kind of fun. You can apply this to any sort of growth rates. That's what's kind of cool about it. It's not just economic variables. It can be lots of different things. All right, so that's how it applies to our country situation, because that is a bit of a real-world story. The past 10 years, China has grown at like 7 to 10%, while the United States has been growing at 2 to 3%, as we discussed. And so we should expect that China will eventually catch up to us. And how long is that going to take? We're coming up with around 20 years. If China maintains a 10% growth rate and the United States is stuck at 2, the Chinese people are going to have per capita incomes roughly equal to ours in about 22 years. And China will rule the world. I don't know about that. As long as we have more nuclear warheads, we're probably okay. We can go back to Cold War type stuff. All right. So let's see. Your book has some nice pictures on that stuff. I think we're going to get into the production function stuff. All right. Any last questions or comments there? Let me do I'm going to do the last example with the prices, because I think that's a good one to remember too. We talked about it, but I didn't write it. Well, I guess I did kind of write it down. Let me give it to you a little more formally. Example number 2. If inflation is equal to 3%, when will the price of a hamburger double from $1 to $2? And then we already got the answer down there. Rule of 72, 70 divided by the 3% gives me approximately 23 years. Okay. Our next topic is a production function. Production function. Looking up. Remember that one? Did you guys sing that one when you were little? Except it was really conjunction function. What's the real? I forget. Conjunction function. Okay. So we got the production function now. That will be the song in your head the rest of the day, probably. And I'm going to get a little ugly on you first, and then we'll get to graphing. So the production function simply shows how things are made. So it shows output, which is going to be our dollar value of all final goods and services, real GDP, shows output as a function of resources and technology. So in some ways, it's very related to the production possibilities frontier. the production possibilities frontier had the beer and pizza. I won't read, you guys have it on your notes from before. I'll quickly draw it over here we had the beer and pizza. These were outputs, right? Beer and pizza, that was the final goods. The production function is going to show those things related between the resources and the output. So first of all, kind of conceptually, the real GDP is equal to some function of labor and capital. We could throw land in there too, but I'm just going to kind of keep it easy. And we could throw technology in there too, but just to keep things kind of easy here. So this is real GDP, which is the quantity of beer, pizza, chicken wings, pork, dollar value, well, final goods and services, right? So we've got the quantity of beer this is the generic math language for is a function of the things in the brackets. Is a function of labor, the quantity of labor, and the quantity of capital. So this is a generic mathematical expression. So note, this is a generic math equation missing the guts or the details of how it all works. So to give you an example of something with some guts, so an example with guts might be the amount of beer that I have is equal to 46 plus L plus 4K plus LK, L times K plus K squared. Something real ugly. I'm just making this up, by the way, as I go, right? But just conceptually, if I knew that if L equals 100 and K equals 10, you could solve for the amount of output that you get. How many beers does that make us, right? 46 plus 100 is 146, plus 4 times 10 is 40 is 186, plus 10 times 100 is 1,000 is 1,086, plus K squared is 100 equals $1,186. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that, by the way. I just was kind of going around. So Y equals $1,186. That was kind of awesome. Sorry, I'm going to brag, but that was kind of fun. I totally did not expect to be able to do that, but the numbers I chose were conveniently easy. If I did it right. Did I do it right? Did you guys watch me as I did them?
1,286.
No! 1,286. That's what I said. We'll look back on the tape here, but something like that. I think I got there. So that is a way of thinking about the production function. Okay. So graphically, what does that look like? Well, we're going to put Y on the vertical axis and L, one of the resources, on the horizontal axis. And if I did that, would I expect a positive or negative relationship between the two? In other words, an upward sloping line or a downward sloping line or maybe a flat line. Quantity of labor, quantity of output. So one point was L equals 100, Y equals 1286. There's one point. What do the other points look like? If I was to pick off some, this is where I'm pretty sure my equation would be wrong, probably, but where do the rest of the points lie? And now, don't think math, think reality. This is what makes economics fun. If I add more people to my production process, if I hire more workers, am I going to get more beer or less beer? More, right? So how does that transform itself graphically then? Upward sloping, downward sloping, or flat? Upward sloping, right? So we're going to have a relationship like that. Is that expected to look like A, B, or C?
C.
C? Why?
Because at some point you kind of reach your max labor output.
Okay, so if we keep adding more and more people, is it reasonable to expect that we'll get exponential growth? All we need is more people. Not really, right? Linear relationship would be add another 100 people, get another 1,286 units. Well, that might be a possibility if each person is given more machines and buildings and stuff, right? But if in this picture, what we're holding constant is the amount of machines. So imagine that we had 10 machines, but 200 people. Would we be able to continue on the way we were doing before? Eventually, we're going to lose efficiency, right? Those extra people are going to start to fall off. And so that brings us to this, one of the top 3 principles of economics that those of you at Micro had this before, the law of diminishing marginal product. The law of diminishing returns is captured by this one with C. So this is the law of diminishing marginal product. Honestly, I kind of want to make sure that they use that. I don't know where they have it. I don't know if I'll actually find it that place, but labor productivity. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'll define it. I think that's the way your text reads it. I'll define this in a second here, but law of diminishing marginal product. So we don't really expect that this would last over the long haul. We wouldn't have A, B, or C, or A or B, we'd have C. Eventually, C would kick in. All right, so law of diminishing marginal product, which also is called the law of diminishing returns. Okay, here we go. As you add more and more labor to a fixed amount of capital, as you add more and more labor to a fixed amount of capital, the productivity of each additional unit of labor eventually falls or diminishes. So graphically, C, this curve here, shows that effect for the production function. All right, so let's clean that up a little bit more. So here we're measuring labor hours. I'm changing, this is a little bit of a change from what we did in unemployment. When we calculated unemployment, what were we measuring? So unemployment, last week, what was the unemployment rate, for instance? Number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. So in other words, our measure of labor was number of people, right? So sometimes we use labor hours, sometimes we use number of human beings. So watch for that on some of your problems or other things you might get into. Here, we're measuring hours of labor being worked, not number of human beings. So it's a little bit of a twist on the production function. If we have a certain amount of labor hours being worked, how much real GDP do I get? And that graph looks like this. It's called the production function. Okay, so what are some things that can help grow an economy? So let's kind of think, where does economic growth come from? We'll write that on the board while you cogitate on that one. Where does economic growth come from? Let's kind of brainstorm this. There's a lot of right answers. And so I want you guys to kind of trust your gut feeling. Think about the data we looked at. Africa, Japan, Hong Kong, Central America, the Ukraine, the United States. Where does economic growth come from? Let's brainstorm some ideas of what you think, why countries might differ in economic growth. Technology, good. So let's go up here, technology. And in fact, yeah, let's brainstorm first, and then I'll come back and talk about some things. So technology, good. Resources. Like what? Let's be more specific. Natural resources, good. Okay, what else? Demand for? Okay, so demand for certain products. Okay, we're brainstorming, so I'm not going to shoot you down here. But there's some other things. Culture. Now, try to hone in on economic growth. Government regulation, good. Regulation, which is really law, right? So regulation or laws in general. What else? Size of the labor force, good. Size of the labor force. What's that? Yeah, that would probably fall into here, yes. So a lot of things fall into here. So size of labor force. What else about the labor force? Differs between, what's that?
Efficiency.
Efficiency, so in what, yeah, so what would you label that? efficiency could work, but I just want to, where does more efficiency come from?
Education.
Skills and education, good. So our human capital, so skills / education of labor, which touches on what the book calls the human capital. Rather than thinking about people as a lump of coal, you add 10 hours of labor and you get this. Well, depending on who we add, we might be more productive in some cases than others. Okay? Anything else?
Trade.
Trade, okay? Absolutely, that's what we saw with our production possibilities. We open up trade and we have economic growth. Anything else? Okay, so this is a nice list here to kind of think about what causes an economy to grow. From our production possibilities frontier, how did we show growth, first of all? Graphically, how did we show it? What was the first thing we did when we started off with it?
Expanded.
And expanded out, right? So our production possibilities went outward. And how did it shift out? What changed? The production possibilities frontier shows the maximum combinations of two goods an economy can produce, given its available resources and technology. So we're right up here to these resources, natural resources, size of the labor force, skills of the labor force. Right, so that really touches on these right away, on causing that type of growth. Okay, so if there's a change in technology here, what do you think happens to the production function if there's a change in technology? How does this thing move? Or do we simply move along it? Like from a point like A to a point like B, right? There's economic growth here. If we look at YA versus YB, that's economic growth, right? Increase in real GDP. But what if it's technology? What do you think happens to it? It shifts up, right? So if there's more technology, there's more potential for the economy. If there's more technology or there's more machines, which I guess we didn't even list here, more natural resources, more of something, then that's going to be a shift upward of the production function. Okay, so from our production function, since it was a function of resources and technology, we can tie it back in a fundamental way, the way the model's developed here, back to those resources and technology. So key point, an increase in resources or an increase in technology shifts, I'm going to be a little, shifts up the production function. And then I got to clean this up a little bit. So an increase in resources or an increase in technology shifts up the production function, like we've got it shown. But it's not all resources. An increase in resources other than labor. Because if it's labor, it's a movement from A to B. Okay? So an increase in resources other than labor. So an increase in labor is simply a movement along the production function from LA to LB. This would have came about from possibly an increase in capital or increase in technology. Okay, so Now that we've got the Y down, how can an economy increase economic growth? So are there things we can do to increase resources and technology? In other words, so what we're saying is, how do we, rewritten here, how to increase resources and technology? That's the question. So where does economic growth come from? It comes from resource and technology changes. Is there a way to do that? What are some things we do in the United States that helps produce more technology or more machines, more capital, or possibly enhance our amount of human capital? What do we do? Okay, so we can potentially fund or subsidize research and development. Might be one thing to do. So again, kind of brainstorming here. Do we subsidize? Certainly a path that we've taken in the past. Subsidize research and development. R&D, research and development. Okay? So this is government subsidizing, right? So government doing something. What else does the United States do? Educate the labor force. Good. So increase education. So we have mandatory, we got the K through 12. We subsidize college education in a variety of ways. Some of that is giving you guys access to low interest loans, or potentially just Pell Grant money, gift money from the federal government. They help support state universities with some funding, right? So there's lots of different ways. We got education. So we got education, research and development to try to beef up some of these things. Okay, reduce regulations and trade. So that kind of brings us to our hot button of the day. So, and I don't want to seem like kind of biased on this, so I want to say maybe just regulations and something. I don't know what I want to say. And the reason I don't want to bias it is because some regulations might create an environment where this helps the situation. Classic example would be what? If you come up with a brand new invention, you think it's awesome, and you're going to make millions, what do you do in the United States? Get a copyright, get a patent, right? Some sort of protection. That is government protection of intellectual property, right? So that's one activity of law, regulation that can help stimulate it. So it's not always restricting it. So let's put regulation / law change. And that can move both directions, and that's where we'll pick up on Wednesday.